In the previous video we discussed the course as a whole and the various steps that we're going to work through in order for you to be able to create stunning black and white images. Let's now take the first of those steps by taking an introductory look at black and white conversion techniques. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to do three things. First, we're going to take a look at the black and white conversion techniques we'll be covering during the course. What we're then going to do is take a more detailed look at some of the simpler techniques, and we're going to explain why these simpler techniques are problematic. So the techniques we're going to look at in this video are on the left, and that's the desaturate command, hue saturation tool, grayscale mode, and using the gradient map. Techniques we're going to discuss in subsequent videos are lab color mode, calculations method, twin hue saturation method, the channel mix from black and white tools, and the camera raw plugin. So why these particular techniques and no others? I've already mentioned that the simpler techniques are problematic, so why bother including them? The reason I'm doing it is because what they will do is they will illustrate the problems you will run into when converting images to black and white. So we'll have an image, we'll use a simple technique, and for various reasons it's not going to work all that well. So we're going to discover these problems, and then the later techniques we're going to use are going to be kind of the solutions to these problems. So it's kind of just a way of working through these techniques, discovering the problems, discovering the solutions, and thinking about what it is we need to do when we convert an image to black and white. Kind of the more powerful techniques we're going to be looking at, particularly the black and white tool, channel mixer tool, and the camera raw plugin, they kind of stand on their own merit and don't need much explanation. They're all relatively easy to use, they're all quite flexible, and they will all allow you to create stunning black and white images. Now there are other techniques I could have included. If you do a search on the internet, you'll find quite a few more ways of converting an image to black and white. Typically though, these tend to be quite complicated or overly complex in my opinion. They don't do anything that you won't be able to do by the end of this course using the tools I'm going to recommend, so I kind of haven't included them. I also haven't included any third-party plugins, so for example Nix Silver Effects Pro. It's a great plugin, it's great at what it does, but by the end of this course you'll find that you will be able to do everything that that plugin can do, but you will be able to do it better. Okay, so that summarises where we're going with this video. But before we move on to take a look at some of the simpler techniques I mentioned earlier, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about a slightly different way of categorising these techniques, and that's in terms of what I call this technique matrix. As you can see, this splits the techniques in terms of destructive versus non-destructive, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment, but also in terms of the amount of control each technique provides, and by control here I mean the extent to which you can vary the appearance of the image during the raw conversion process. You'll also notice that some of these techniques are marked in blue and some are red. The blue techniques are the ones we're going to be concentrating on in later videos. These are the ones I'm going to recommend that you use. But we're also going to work our way through the red techniques because these will illustrate some of the things we need to be thinking about when we're converting a black and white image. And finally, you may also notice the camera raw plugin is listed as both a destructive and a non-destructive technique. Now, this relates to the way in which you convert your raw file, but when we get to the section looking at the camera raw plugin, I'll explain why it is that this technique falls into both categories. Okay, so let's begin our discussion of these various techniques by taking a look at the first three in the top left-hand box. So these are labelled destructive and they're labelled no control. So let's switch into Photoshop and we'll explain what's meant by destructive and we'll also explain what's meant by no control. Okay, so here's our first colour image. It's a stop sign outside an abandoned factory in Bulgaria. And we're going to use this image to illustrate some of these simpler techniques. Okay, so the first one we mentioned was image adjustments and desaturate. So I'm going to the image menu, I'm selecting the adjustments submenu and I'm selecting desaturate. So as soon as I click this, what you'll see is we get a black and white image, and it doesn't look too bad. The point here though is that what we've made to the image is a destructive change. Let's now take a look at the layers palette. You can see the icon here. In fact, just to make this a little bit easier, let's change the size of this icon so we can have a close look. And you can see now a little mini black and white image. If we go back to the color image in the history palette down here on the bottom right, you can see the original color image. When we desaturate the image using image adjustments desaturate, we get a black and white image. So what we've effectively done here is we've removed the color data from the image, but we've done so in a destructive way. It's not as though we've not destroyed the color data, we've just kind of taken the color out and we've created a black and white image. Okay, before we look at why this is so problematic, let's just look at another couple of ways of doing this. So we'll go back to the color image. Again, we'll go image adjustments and hue saturation. This brings up a dialog, We're going to look at these sliders later on in a slightly different context, but for the time being what we need to know here is that to create a black and white image using the hue saturation tool, you need to drag the saturation slider all the way to the left. So there's a numerical value of -100. And again, what this does is it creates a black and white image. But again, as you can see, this is a destructive change. It's removed the color data, leaving you with just a black and white image. If we compare the two, so here's hue saturation, here's the desaturate, you can see that they're identical. Okay, let's take a look at one further destructive method. So let's go back again to the color image. And this time, instead of image adjustments, we're going to go to image and the mode submenu. And you'll notice now that we're working with an RGB color image. We'll explain what an RGB color image is later when we look at the channel mixer. So we're going to look at the R, the G and the B channels. But for the time being, let's just select grayscale. Photoshop's popping up a warning now asking us do we really want to discard this color information. And to control the conversion, use image adjustments black and white. Now, for reasons I'll explain later, this isn't a great suggestion. There'd be a much better way of doing this. But for the time being, we're just going to kind of say, yeah, okay, yeah, we'll discard the color information. So click the discard button, and once again, you'll see from the layers palette we've made a destructive change, and we've left with a black and white image. If we compare these, you'll see that desaturate and hue saturation, so I'm kind of selecting between the two using the history palette, these are identical, and grayscale is slightly different. It's just a little bit brighter. In each of the three cases, though, we've made a destructive change to the image. So we've taken the color data out and we've left ourselves with simply just a black and white image. Okay, so why is this a problem? As much as anything else, it's a workflow issue. So for example, say we've converted this image to black and white and we decide that of the two versions we prefer the grayscale conversion. It's just a little bit brighter, maybe there's a little bit more impact in the image. And then we spend, say, another 20 minutes using a whole variety of techniques to enhance the image. Maybe we add a vignette, maybe we add a bit more contrast to the sign here, and then maybe we tone the image. And then we decide, well, actually no, perhaps the hue saturation version would have been better. The only way we can do the hue saturation version instead is to go right back to the beginning. So either we track back through the history palette right to the start, or we just close the image and start right over. So in that sense, making a destructive change, it's not a good idea if there's any doubt in your mind that you might want to change it. Now sometimes making a destructive change would be fine. You would hit upon exactly the right black and white conversion. More often than not though, there may be a different technique you want to use, or you may wish to tweak the technique that you have used. So as you'll see when we get to the techniques that offer more control, what you can sometimes do is go back and maybe make a small change. So for example, you'll see one of the images we look at later is a seascape, and in that image we can vary the brightness of the sand, which is kind of red, and we can vary the brightness of the sky, which is blue. So we can have a more dramatic image by making the sand brighter and the sky darker and so on. If we commit ourselves to a destructive change right from the outset, then there's no way we can go back other than starting from scratch. So in terms of workflow, using destructive techniques is not a good idea. Okay, so if we want to avoid making a destructive change to an image, let's see what we can do. Let's first switch back to our technique matrix. And you'll see here, let's take a look at these two techniques in the top right box. So again, these offer no control, but these are non-destructive techniques. So let's flick back to our image, use the history palette to go back to our original color image. Now we're going to use the hue saturation tool again, but this time instead of image adjustments and hue saturation, we're going to go to the layer menu and we're going to select what's called a new adjustment layer and hue saturation. Now this time, instead of bringing up the dialog immediately, it's prompting us for a name, so we're just going to accept hue saturation. We're also going to ignore these other things down here. We don't need to change any of these, so we're going to click OK. Now this time we don't get the dialog box, we get the controls popping up in the properties palette. Now if you're using a fairly recent version of Photoshop, you will have the properties palette. If you're using an older version, for example CS2, you will still get the dialog. To all intents and purposes though, the changes you make are identical, it's just where these controls appear. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to drag the saturation slider all the way to the left, and again it's a numerical value of -100. So what we now have is, if we take a look at the layers palette, we have a background layer, and we have what's called an adjustment layer, a hue saturation adjustment layer. So if we use the history palette, we can compare this to the hue saturation adjustment, and that one there. So there's the destructive application of a hue saturation adjustment, and there's the use of the hue saturation tool using an adjustment layer. So why is this non-destructive? As you can see from the layers palette, we still have the color data here. So here's our hue saturation adjustment as an adjustment layer. Here's our color layer. And you'll notice now that what we can do is we can click here, this little eye symbol, and you'll notice it says indicates layer visibility. If we click there, we can turn it off. So at this stage, there's not much we can do here. We can turn it on and off. We can't configure the hue saturation adjustment. Remember, this is a technique that offers no control. But we haven't made a destructive change to the image. So this is a superior method insofar as in terms of workflow, if we then go on and make a range of subsequent changes above it, so we add a curves adjustment layer, we maybe add a selective color adjustment layer above that to tone the image, what we've then done is we've made non-destructive changes to the image. If we then decide we want the color image, all we have to do is turn off the hue saturation adjustment layer, and there's all the color data underneath. So there's the first method of creating a non-destructive black and white conversion. Before we move on to take a look at the second method, I just want to show you a quick shortcut for creating adjustment layers. So to create the hue saturation adjustment layer here, what we did was we went Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and hue saturation. That's not especially difficult, but you're kind of navigating through a variety of menus. What we could have done, and just let me delete this one first. So I've right clicked on the layer and I'm going to select delete layer. So that gets rid of this hue saturation adjustment layer. What I'm now going to do is click the little symbol here at the bottom of the layers palette. So what this says, you can see it's popped up now, create new fill or adjustment layer. So if I click here, what you'll see is it brings up a list, and again I can select hue saturation. This time it doesn't prompt me for a name, it's defaulted to call it hue saturation 1, but again it pops up the controls in the properties palette, and again I can drag the slide to the left all the way to -100, and we've created a black and white image. So functionally it's much the same as using the layer menu. You don't get the option to rename the layer, which sometimes can be useful, but it is just a little bit quicker. So when we're creating subsequent adjustment layers, I'm going to use kind of the probably use this more than I use the layer palette. It's just a little bit quicker and saves a little bit of time. Okay, so again that's the first method, the hue saturation adjustment layer. Okay, so let's end this introductory video by taking a look at one further technique. Now again, if we switch back to our technique matrix, we're going to take a look at the gradient map. So this is another non-destructive technique. We're applying this via an adjustment layer, and again it's one that offers no control. Well, as you'll see, that's not strictly true. It does offer some control, but the control it does offer is quite limited. Okay, so let's jump back to our image. Let's deactivate our hue saturation adjustment layer. Now we don't need to delete this, all we need to do is deactivate it. And then we're going to create a gradient map adjustment layer. Now if your image ends up looking something like this, this is clearly not what we wanted. What we need to do is we need to edit the gradient. So we're going to click here. So as you can see it says click to edit the gradient, and this brings up the gradient editor. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to click the third preset in here, and this is black white. Now what this does, as you can see, is it resets the gradient from black to white. Now the way in which the gradient editor works is it remaps the pixels within the image dependent upon their original brightness. So very dark pixels become black and very bright pixels become white. Everything in between is mapped from black to white. Now I mentioned there's some limited control you can have with the gradient editor. If I click on this color stop here and then drag it to the right, what you'll see is the shadow detail in the image becomes a lot darker. So what I'm effectively doing is what's called remapping the black point. So I'm making the darker detail within the image darker still. So let's reset that. At the other end, if I click the white color stop and I drag that to the left, what I can do is make the highlights brighter. So I can alter the contrast with this technique, but I don't have any fine scale control over altering the density of particular colors. What I can also do, if I double click this color stop, I can change the color. So what I've got here is I've got the color picker. It's the Apple color picker rather than the standard Photoshop picker, simply because it's easier to demonstrate things with. So what I'm going to do, instead of black, I'm going to set this to reasonably dark grey, and I'm going to click OK. So what's happening now is the image has been remapped from kind of a medium dark grey through to white. So there's no blacks in the image anymore. We can see this from the histogram up here, so there's no deep shadow detail. And again, if I do the same with the white stop and I make that darker, what you'll see is the highlights will get darker, and I've restricted the tonal range now, so there's no highlight detail and no shadow detail. So not especially useful. It would be very rare that you would want to flatten the contrast of an image when you convert it to black and white, and kind of by the same token you're probably not going to want to clip the shadow detail and the highlight detail by dragging these colour stops in, so doing this and this, but it is kind of a limited form of control. So okay, so there's, let's just reset those back, let's click OK. So there's the final conversion method that we're going to look at in this video. So what have we got so far? We looked at the desaturate method and the hue saturation method, and we looked at applying the hue saturation method as an adjustment layer. We also looked at the grayscale method, which was the third destructive technique we discussed. We then looked at applying a hue saturation adjustment as a adjustment layer, and this is a non-destructive change, but again it gives us very little control. And we looked at using a gradient map as an adjustment layer. Again, it doesn't give us a great deal of control. It does, however, give us some slight variation. So we have the gradient map version, we have the grayscale version, and we have the hue saturation version. They're not significantly different, but there is a minor change there. So let's just go back to our conversion matrix before we finished. So what we've done here is we've looked at the difference between destructive and non-destructive, and I would always suggest that you use non-destructive techniques where possible. We're going to make an exception later on when we look at the lab color mode, and you may want to make an exception when you take a look at the calculations method. It's not a technique I recommend, but it is very powerful. But all the ones we've looked at so far have offered no control. So we've been able to convert the image to black and white, but in a particular way, and we haven't been able to alter the image based upon its colour. That's something we're going to look at in the next video.